So I will start. Is that okay with you, Dr. Richard? Okay. So welcome back, everyone. And still we are waiting for more people to join. I think like they're in the main room or having their break. So we are looking forward to have them here with us. We are delighted to have Dr. Gabriela Richard, who is an assistant professor of education, learning design and technology in the learning and performance system at Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Richard is a researcher, designer, and educator of learning technologies, media, games, and play. Before Penn State, she was a postdoctoral fellow for a competitive program sponsored by the Vice Provost for Research at the University of Pennsylvania and affiliated with the Career for Collaboration, Computation, Complexity, and Creativity in the Learning Sciences. Dr. Richard obtained her Ph.D. from New York University in Educational Communication Technology, and her master's degree was from the Interactive Telecommunication Program, where she designed interactive and embedded systems. Our topic today will be disrupting bias in and through design, challenges, and possibilities for transformative media and technology. The presentation examines historic structures that impact diversity, equitable participation, and design in STEM fields and learning environments, and provide research-based approaches that can transform and improve careers and technology. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard, for being with us.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you everyone for coming to the talk today. So as we discussed earlier, I'm going to be discussing some of my work on disrupting bias in and through design, and in particular using my work to kind of highlight different examples of why we need to consider the design of technologies and systems, not just in the interactive elements, but also the design of the tools themselves as we are thinking through possibilities for greater equity and inclusion. So the focus of my remarks today are really going to be coming from the perspective of research, of educational research, but also research in computing and information sciences and related fields, as well as game studies. Quite a bit of my work has focused on the design of games, being a very prevalent kind of interactive design that most people are familiar with in this day and age when they're thinking about technology and careers in STEM. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about research perspectives as they come out of educational research. And it's really this idea that cognition is situated in distributed, embodied, and affective and cultural experiences. So a lot of our earliest experiences as we're learning are very much around play. We tend to downplay play as we get older, but play is really an integral and important part of learning throughout our lives, particularly in our early lives when we're really starting to interact with the social world around us. We're mimicking our elders and trying to understand the world. If you remember when you were children, you often start by playing house or playing with different technologies or tools or different things around you. And that's an important part of our development, but it's something that tends to be overemphasized in childhood and less emphasized as we get older, although we continue to play with the tools and the systems in our culture. So I really come from this research perspective that reinforces this ecological view of learning through the social world, which is really that we are learning throughout our lives. In fact, what the research shows, and this comes from the Life Center, is that we actually only spend a small fraction of our lives in formal education. So that in our K through 12 years, which is the majority of our formal education, we only actually spend less than 20% of our time in formal educational structures of learning. And throughout our lives, we spend less so, and especially when we're adults, we're not really thinking about ourselves as part of a formal learning context. But most of what we are engaging in is learning in different ways, really self-directed learning. So it might be learning around your job or your profession, You're seeking out resources. Often and increasingly, we're going to technological resources. In fact, the Pew Research Center released a report that a lot of people are spending most of their time learning things on YouTube. So it's interesting to think about how much learning has shifted, or this idea of learning has shifted. And much more of our learning actually happens in these informal contexts that are not really considered vetted contexts that have been designed for learning, like YouTube. Another research perspective that really reinforces this ecological view is connected learning, and connected learning really emphasizes the ways that, I mean, they did work, Mimi Ito and her colleagues did work looking at youth, but it's really increasingly people of all ages that are engaging in these different kinds of systems and environments, usually whether it be social media, whether it be through peer culture, that we're continuing to engage in different interest-driven learning, but that learning is very much mediated amongst who we have access to, who our peers are, who we know, what our social capital is, the opportunities we become aware of, and the different socio-technical systems around us. So again, whether it be live streaming environments, whether it be different social media tools, whether it be YouTube, we're spending more and more of our lives learning and sharing our knowledge in more of this socially mediated space. And then the third perspective that I really like to include in this ecological view is this communities of practice model, which comes from Leib and Wenger's work. They were anthropological researchers that really looked at the ways that people were engaging in professional domains. So originally they were looking at what it takes to become like a master tailor, what it takes to become a master apprentice in different kinds of fields. But these days we're looking at more and more professions. So they wanted to understand how knowledge occurs in authentic contexts, usually workplace environments. And they found that there's a shared domain or shared interest area that people wanted to learn more about. And they would start in that community, usually peripherally, engaging peripherally in what they call legitimate peripheral participation, to learn their craft. And then as they started to become more expert, they became more central to the community. But so much of that was mediated by culture. And that's what's important here, is that even within these different learning spaces, there's a culture that forms around that learning. And there are values that are placed within those contexts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between gaming, computing, and related STEM careers. So there have been historic inequities in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. I tend to focus a lot in tech fields, but a lot of these issues are shared throughout. And I focus a lot on video games because quite a bit of research, particularly in the early days of video games until now, 1980s until now, has shown that so much of what mediates, at least in the United States and North America, what mediates that participation is around this early interest formation, which tends to happen through playful experiences with computing. And those playful experiences are usually through games. But unfortunately, in those early days of gaming, a lot of that was mediated by gender, because there weren't really equitable gender representations in games, or also in the ways that peers were supported in playing games, or adults would support children in playing games or learning with the computer. So we tended to find that there were a lot of relationships between these assumptions around gender, these biases around gender, and who went on to different fields, particularly in computing and technology. And those barriers have remained. And what's really interesting about this graph is that it shows how in the early days of computer science, that being the orange graph on the left, women were actually getting close to parity with men. And in fact, in the very, very early days, women kind of outnumbered men because they were the first computer programmers back when the term was computing and it was considered a secretarial task. But then there was a sharp decline in the 1980s, which actually coincided with the rise of video games and game culture. So there has been a marked shift, which they were able to trace back to those gendered biases that I brought up before around gaming and computing, who was supported and who wasn't. And then looking at this across not just gender, but race and ethnicity, we also see that a lot of these historic problems are intersectional. So there was a study done a few years ago by code.org, and they found that not only are there issues around gender equity in computing jobs and tech fields, but there is also underrepresentation across racial background, particularly if you look at population statistics and as you look at more highly technical aspects of those jobs. So if you're thinking about Silicon Valley as a whole, there might be better representation, but then if you drill down to who's actually doing the very technical jobs in each of those companies, you tend to find less and less diversity. So there was actually a report released a couple of years ago, and they looked across gender and race, and they actually found that the situation was much worse for women of color, particularly Black and Latinx women, who were greatly underrepresented in the workforce. And that was in relationship to holding comparable degrees. So of those who were getting computer science or engineering-based degrees for which they would be qualified to hold these jobs, they were still finding significant underrepresentation. So there was an overrepresentation of some groups and a particular underrepresentation of Black and Latinx women because of both the gendered biases and the racialized and otherwise culturally informed biases. So going back to some of the representational issues in commercial games, we found that once the representational themes emerged in the mid-'80s, that's when we started to see a lot more biases, particularly across gender, maybe less so around race. That came a little bit later on. And this is a report from the early 2000s by the American Association of University Women, but they also found that not just with commercial games, but also in educational games, there was an overrepresentation of male designers. And there seemed to be a correlation between that and having a lot of sexist stereotypes in those early educational games that also had an impact on how children were seeing themselves in relation to computing and technology and their capabilities. If we're looking at commercial games, there has been some change in some of the gender and racialized statistics around who's developing games. It's gotten slightly more equitable. In 2014, they release these numbers every 10 years, so we'll have newer ones in 2024. But we tend to see that the lack of gender and racialized representation in these commercial designs also affects who's developing games. Or I don't want to say it affects because that's like a causal claim, but it's more of a correlational relationship. So we see that there's significant overrepresentation of male characters, a significant overrepresentation of white characters when there is race discerned, and we see similar statistics in who's developing games. And if we look historically at the work that interrogated video games and different kinds of products, we see that there wasn't a lot of work that looked at race until about the mid I would say probably about 10 years ago was when the work started to emerge that was looking not only at gender differences and gender issues in how games were designed, but also bringing in race, ethnicity, and culture into thinking about how can we not only interrogate the design of games, but think through possibilities for how we could come up with better designs. And that also played into what was being addressed generally in the field, because if we don't actually have these studies, then we don't really have a framework to work from to understand what are the design issues that we should be concerned about. So some of the real world implications of these design deficits have been about 10 years ago when Gamergate happened, and Gamergate was sort of a social media fueled attack primarily on women who were game developers, women in games journalism, and even some female game players. We found that there were a lot of social media campaigns that later became bigger political campaigns around issues of identity. And a lot of this came back to what was happening around game design and what was not addressed. So people being able to trace back some of their activism or some of their political views to Gamergate, to these kind of social media campaigns that seemed to be frivolous at the time because they were about video games, later led to some ideas around larger scale politics that had an effect on, you know, our greater culture in the United States. And we've also seen some design decisions that have played into some really problematic ideas online. So these are some examples of live streaming campaigns that happened that targeted different people who were presumed to not really belong within gaming or in different spaces. So there was a rebranding campaign of this popular character called Pepe the Frog, who was designed by Matt Fury as part of his comic book in the early 2000s, and later it was rebranded to be sort of a hate symbol that was used quite a bit as a sort of like invisible in cultural symbol in live streaming. So a lot of people would not recognize that this frog was a problematic symbol, but if you knew some of the cultural inbranding within some of the gaming spaces, then seeing Pepe the Frog immediately brought up some of these hateful associations. So a lot of live streaming content creators have overwhelmingly been male and white, and a lot of Hispanic, Latinx, Black, and Indigenous live streamers have not been as prominently featured until very recently. During the pandemic, there were a lot of campaigns to increase diversity, and so Twitch really made an effort to diversify who they featured as prominent content creators. But prior to that, a lot of non-white, non-male content creators were getting a lot of backlash, and oftentimes it was invisible backlash. And an example of that is on the left. This is featuring a famous Hearthstone player who's a Black player, and he actually was subjected to a racialized attack when he was featured at DreamHack, which is a top competitive gaming space. So these are important things to be aware of, is how emotes and different kinds of icons within an insular community like gaming have taken on a more prominent role and can have effects on how people perceive of things. And that kind of comes from the design deficits discussed before. So really what this highlights is that oftentimes in tech, we have historically taken a content agnostic position, which is basically this position that our designs are value free. Like, even though we know that as designers, we do bring our values to the design process. We have our own personal histories that affects what we think makes up a good design. Unfortunately, we have largely not checked those biases. So we tend to come in with these assumptions that our designs have no effect, but really they do. And it's not just the effect of what we think would be important to put in our games and what characters we think would look cool, but they also, our own values come into the design of the systems themselves, the design of what handheld device you have. Why is it even a handheld device? We're assuming that everybody has the same ability to use their hands and interact with a phone or a tablet in the same way. We have assumptions about the design of the computer, the laptop. We have assumptions about the design of different game controllers. And all of this assumes that people are going to play in a particular way, and that they have a certain sized hand, that they have a certain use of their hands, and that does limit who can play and who can participate. In fact, Able Gamers is a gaming advocacy group for players with disabilities. And one thing that they continuously have had to bring up is that a lot of these systems are too contained in how they're designed. And they had to fight with consoles to allow the keyboard to be used, or different types of assistive devices to be used, because so much prior to their advocacy a few years ago, you could not add different peripheral devices. They weren't allowed because it was considered to be cheating. But that was also limiting who could play and participate with games. So really, we have to think about the interrelationships between representational culture and social learning. So much of how kids and adults interact with the social world in North America primarily, but now increasingly globally, is mediated by a lot of our early experiences online, or continual experiences online. So much of what we are learning and engaging with is happening through social media and the design of different systems around us. One example of this content agnostic position comes from Scratch. So Scratch is an environment where it was designed to be the YouTube of coding, or learning how to code, as the developers at MIT described it. And it's essentially an environment where young people can learn how to code with block-based coding. And then they can share their designs and they can comment on their designs, very much like a YouTube video. However, there was very much this continued position, the content agnostic approach, which is that you know, constructionist software, this was meant to be a form of constructionist software, allows children to just be creative, and they're going to create these really amazing things of their own designs, and it's not going to be really influenced by culture. But what we discovered when we did an analysis, and when other colleagues did an analysis, is that a lot of kids are doing what they do. They're mimicking the culture around them, and they're recreating the designs in the systems around them. So we found that most people were recreating commercial games, and that's great. They were learning a lot through that process. It's really hard to create a 2D version of Doom or Minecraft, right? But at the same time, it's still kind of regurgitating a lot of the same problems that were brought up before, where they're not really critically examining and recreating a different cultural artifact. It's sort of doubling down and reinforcing some of the similar problems. So in our study, we actually went through and we did a content analysis of Scratch and the kinds of designs that were being created. And what we found was that a lot of people using Scratch did not feel comfortable disclosing their cultural background. And we found some discussions where they were discussing their cultural background, and there was a lot of discomfort. There were a lack of projects with diverse themes, so projects that were discussing things other than commercial products. And there was an active dismissal when there were projects that were specifically trying to discuss issues of bias or racism or, personal experiences of minoritized groups. An example is on the left of a scratcher who created one project about experiencing racism and bullying, and he got so much negative pushback that he decided he was going to leave Scratch forever, or at least he wrote that on his project. So there are some concerns about who's being supported and in what ways there might be active dismissal. Another perspective here is by Sofia Noble. She wrote a whole book on algorithms of oppression, and she was sort of bringing to light some of the underlying problems in the algorithms, which are even less visible to people. So what are those algorithms of engagement? The algorithms that YouTube uses, for example, is an algorithm of engagement. They see you looking up certain videos, and then they tell you they promote other videos. Well, we found that there are a lot of problems with that. There are some recent studies that are showing how YouTube's algorithms, and YouTube owned by Google, their algorithms have actually encouraged people to engage in some radical content, which could be really problematic. Her work looks specifically at search engines and found that there were a lot of algorithms behind search engines that were problematic, particularly for minoritized groups. And she looked at Black women in particular and Black girls, and how searching for different terms actually led down a rabbit hole of stereotypes around people of color. And so some of her recommendations are that we have to be more aware of the values that we're placing in the design of our media, particularly since that media is global and is so widely reaching and influencing. And that there needs to be a lot more of a focus on liberal arts, humanities, and social sciences in our technical programs, like our computer science and engineering programs, where there often is an underemphasis on liberal arts education that would be important if we're going to train the next generation of people designing these systems. Another pitfall of content agnosticism are other wider sociocultural effects. So we've seen big problems in the design of AI and other algorithmic systems, particularly in surveillance technologies. So there's been a lot of work that has shown that darker skinned people generally, but particularly women, are misclassified. There have been a lot of problems with different surveillance technologies and over policing, and a lot of that also goes into the faulty design of the system to begin with. So these are all things that kind of come from, again, that content agnostic approach and the lack of interrogation of some of the biases in our designs. I've also done some work that's really looked at what are the possibilities of communities of practice. So we've talked about the problems of the design of systems, but are there other ways that we can think about communities of practice, not just as being gatekeepy, because I talked about that in terms of gaming environments and live streaming environments around gaming and different expectations, but also can communities of practice play a role in helping to support groups that are historically marginalized? So what I found is that within the larger gaming space, there can be what's called stereotype threat activated for minoritized players, so women and players of color, because they're stereotyped not to really belong in these domains or not be skilled in these domains, as they are playing, they're experiencing harassment, they're experiencing different forms of negative behavior that sort of reinforces that they don't belong. So I found that there was, they experienced stereotype threat, which is essentially this idea that you're not as good at it, so it'll affect your performance badly, and long term, it will turn you away from the environment. But what I also found was that supportive communities that are designed to support minoritized players actually created a positive effect. It sort of fostered resilience for them and shielded them from some of these negative experiences. So they were reinforced in their abilities, and it served as a positive boost to their self-esteem that could be protective. So there is a possibility that if you create spaces, right? So one thing that can happen is that we design these social spaces that support people in workplaces, in educational programs, to help encourage that what they're going to experience is not a reality of what their skills are, and building up those positive communities for people. And this really comes from these constructionist ideas around designing these types of systems. So Scratch, as I brought up before, is a constructionist system, which allows young people to create real products. They might be learning with an easier block-based environment, but they're creating actual products and tools that they could then use to show off their skills and to show that they've created a game that could be used by others. But another approach that I've taken is to encourage young people to learn how to design different tools and technologies within a safe space that encourages, not only is it inclusive, but it also encourages them to design culturally responsive products. So they're designing culturally responsive games, but they're also considering how the design of different tools and technologies can allow them to create different kinds of artifacts. So here is an example of how people can learn how to create electronic textiles, which are created using microcontrollers that are sewable microcontrollers, so they can create all kinds of wearables and different kinds of physical designs that can also be integrated with software and digital designs. But what's important about these designs is that using electronic textiles really reinforces how the tools invite different kinds of participation. So we find that when we run workshops around electronic textiles using the sewable microcontrollers, where they can create these interactive wearables, more women participate. And part of the reason why more women and girls participate is because there are these stereotypes around their abilities to sew and positive stereotypes around crafting. But it's actually just as complex as working with the Arduino, which is an engineering environment where you can create all kinds of similar technologies, but they're not wearable. So it's interesting how the tools can change the gendered participation and the sociocultural interests that are expressed by learners. But they also help to highlight where there could be possibilities for the design of different spaces that are inclusive. So the other things that we have to be aware of is making sure that we're promoting diverse participation in our recruitment materials. So one thing that I explicitly do is I make sure that I feature people of different backgrounds, different abilities. I make sure that the space is accessible to everyone. I encourage mixed teams with different genders and different racial backgrounds. And that's really helped to create a more positive and inclusive space. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move forward a little bit. But one of the things I've done is I've combined both environments, like a space where youth can learn how to create interactive digital games as well as integrate their electronic textiles. So they create all kinds of different controllers for their games that are physically and digitally responsive. And through that act of including all of these different tools with these different values, it encourages a lot more diversity in who shows up and the designs that are created as a result. So here are some examples of different designs that were created. They're creating usually rapid prototypes and digital designs and working together to do that. And what we found is that there's a lot of integration of not only computational concepts and computational thinking, but a lot greater change in that, particularly for groups that are underrepresented. And I'm not going to show the videos because we don't have time, but these were just some examples of how that played out for different learners. Other mentions here are restoring. That's a new approach that has come out more recently, and that's using narrative as part of the design process. So having youth really interrogate the design of the different narratives or character-driven stories with different environments, whether they be games, whether it be virtual reality, but having youth really think through what are these overarching narratives that are told in games and different interactive systems, and how can I explore that at a deeper level. So that's another approach that I've seen others like Yasmin Kafai and Mia Shah take to help address issues of equity and inclusivity. So recommendations are really thinking through how we can foster collaborative practices that really help young people and adults not only understand how systems are designed, because that's important for them to be critical thinkers around the systems, but also to change some of their assumptions about who belongs in different domains and as part of the design process. And I will just leave it there. So if anybody has any questions, this is now the time, and I open the floor to you. We have probably about 7 minutes for questions at this point.
Exactly, we have 7 minutes. If you have any question, anything, we're gonna share Dr. Richard's email also here in chat. If you have any question, where you can just contact on the future.
Yeah, could you go back to the slide that mentioned that the creation of community helped the female students to perform better, something like that? You had that idea.
Oh yeah, let me.
That was one of my key takeaways.
Okay, I'll go all the way back. So just to be clear, this was a study. I did a naturalistic study of gaming communities. And from there, we found that there were so many parallels to educational environments. So particularly when you're looking at schools, like schools that are all women, like if you look at Spelman College, which is an HBCU, historically Black university, similar kinds of educational environments have found the positive effects of being in a female supportive space where you see mentors, role models, professors who are defying the odds, because you're at an institution that's all women. So you're going to have your computer science professor is going to be a woman, and they're going to teach you strategies about you know, how they've navigated that space. They're also going to be your role models because they're the ones you're learning from. So we've seen similar things in gaming communities, particularly because gaming was and still is, unfortunately, a hostile space for women who play. So these were professional, competitive gaming communities. So it was high stakes for them. And what I found was similar stereotype threat protective effects. So there was a boost to their self-esteem that protected them against stereotype threat. And what the graph shows is that they were almost on par with men in their sense of their abilities in gaming.
Great. Yeah, so I study human agency and hope, and one of our previous studies was to see what helped people, students, college students with perceived barriers made help them to be hopeful despite of those challenges. And support was the #1 theme. So this is highly related to this. 100% of the interviewees had some sort of support, even a pet. So yeah, this is highly encouraging. And I also saw that yeah, you highlighted personal agency, and also you alluded to the fact that technology has agency. So if you develop good technology that can help them to move further, things like that. So those were very, very interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because I didn't get into a lot of detail with this, just given the time limitation of the talk, but I also studied like which factors of the community really stood out to them, like whether they thought the community was supportive, or whether it was like the role models, or whether it was just like the overall effect. And it was interesting because people did not seem to be that aware of the support, because when it came to perceptions of support, the female supported community actually scored lower than some of the other communities, but overall, their effects were greater, like the effects on self-concept or sense of ability in gaming was significantly more than their sense of whether the community was supportive. So that was really interesting to me. There were other communities that were perceived as more supportive, but actually in the end had way lower scores. In fact, almost every other community, it was a significant decline for women players and minoritized players versus the supportive community. Supportive in the sense that their specific goal is to help female and minoritized players, but how that plays out is perceived differently. So that's really complex in a way.
Yeah, and another key takeaway was that your student-oriented or student-initiated design, you had that portion at the end that had a better result, something like that. So I was thinking that requires a fundamental shift in approach, a teaching approach, like teaching philosophies from objectives, more curriculum-centered approach to student-centered approach, more toward constructive side. So that's another thing that I noticed.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. What really helps is not so much that we're teaching them how to use these different tools or technologies. That only goes so far. What I have found is the greatest impact is to give them the floor of like, this is your space. Now that you've learned how to do all these things, you're going to design something that's personally meaningful. And that's when we see the shift. It's not so much they're learning how to do all these things. That doesn't really have that impact. It's about really giving them the floor to design something that's personally meaningful. Then they start to see the value of why this is so important in their lives. And yeah,
that goes beyond race and so on. It's I think if you are highly student-centered, that's I think student-centered DEI going beyond race, gender, and so on. Right? So.
And it helps to build that confidence, right? Because before, it's a lot of this is implicit. People aren't really thinking about, oh, I don't feel good about my trajectory going into STEM because I'm a girl. It's not like somebody is thinking that actively throughout their lives. They might in different ways, but not, they're not aware of it. But it's also because they have not had the opportunity and they haven't really been able to think through what's important to them. So oftentimes as youth are building these things, they start to realize, hey, I really like this. I didn't realize I could use my creative side and go into a STEM field. I didn't realize I could actually learn how to sew. In fact, it's funny because most of the boys that come get way more interested in sewing than the girls, which is, and so the roles reverse. So I think being able to play with different possibilities is a huge part of this. And then also exploring how diverse they could apply their interests in these STEM fields really has a strong impact too.
Yeah, and I'm paying attention to who they are and what they enjoy truly. Like as a teacher, it seems to be really, really important. So,
yes, definitely.
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Richard, for your interesting presentation. Thank you, Dr. Yun, for the stimulating questions and discussion here. So we put Dr. Richard's email here in chat. So if you have any question, anything, you can or directly communicate with her directly. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard, for being for us for this valuable presentation.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks a lot.